everyone. My name is Brooks Barrett. I'm the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ, and I'm very excited and delighted to have all of you joining with us today for this special edition of our Creation Justice webinar series that I co-host with Michael Malcolm, who is the Executive Director for Interfaith Power and Light in Alabama, and also the Senior Pastor for Rush Memorial United Church of Christ in Atlanta, Georgia. So we will hear from Michael in a second as he brings some theological framing to our discussion for today. But I'm especially delighted to be doing this webinar as we approach Earth Day. I remember some years ago coming across a sermon from a Presbyterian pastor in Oregon who believes that Earth Day should be as big a holiday for people of faith as Christians as Easter and Christmas, in recognition of it being our first calling as people in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so I've always kept that in mind in thinking about the significance of Earth Day in terms of my own faith tradition. So excited to be having this opportunity to engage some experts in climate policy as we gear up for Earth Day. I'd like to now turn things over to LaVonna Grow, who will be introducing our partner for this call, the Washington Interreligious Staff Community's Energy and Ecology Working Group. So, LaVonna, if you could give us an introduction and tell us what WISC is all about.
Well, thanks, Brooks. Yeah, my name is LaVonna Grow. I'm with the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, which is a member of WISC. And WISC, again, does stand for the Washington Interreligious Staff Community. And the larger organization is a network of over 70 of national and religious bodies. And they are organized by working groups. And one of the working groups is the working group that is sponsoring with you today. And we are very happy to have more than 25 of the national faith-based organizations sitting on that table, that working group. And we focus on, we coordinate around federal and international advocacy issues. And we are working on things as much as air, water, public lands, endangered species. We work at both the federal, domestic, and international level, as well as working not only on the legislative side, but also at the executive branch side on things around the our various regulatory issues. And we do things like sign-on letters. We help to organize grassroots activities, and we go to the Hill, the religious community. These are folks that are here primarily in Washington, and this is what they do. We, as I mentioned, meet every 2 weeks and develop policy position papers as well, and principles on various things that are facing us as a nation. So we're really happy to have this collaboration with you. We felt it was important to reach out beyond our inside the Beltway and talk more about what we're doing and what's important that we see on the horizon currently and on the horizon for the 116th Congress. So thank you very much for this opportunity to partner with the Creation Justice webinar series.
Great, thanks. And we are always delighted to partner, so it's terrific to be with all of you. I'm now going to turn things over to my co-host, Michael Malcolm, to give us some theological framing for our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brooks, and all who have joined us. I want to kind of frame this via both a Hebraic and a Judeo-Christian lens. And using in particular this scripture in Ecclesiastes 12 and 13, it says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone." it is important for us to consider the whole matter when it comes down to not only our way of being in our individual lives, but as those who are faith leaders, we should consider the whole matter when it comes to what we teach and what we preach in the lives of others. And so in that frame, one of the things that we're taught to do, and one of the things that I see we neglect quite often from our places of position as faith leaders, is that of caring for creation. And by creation, I mean, again, the whole matter, not just our individual selves, not just our individual families, but being able to care for all living things, all living creatures. But in order to do that, the scripture says that how can one hear without a preacher? And how can that preacher preach unless that preacher has been sent? And we as faith leaders, we as a community of faith, we should consider how we speak into the lives of our parishioners, how we speak into the lives of those we influence. And one of the ways that we can do that is by learning not only scripture, which is excellent and should be our primary source, but having our foot both in scripture and out in society to take a reading of what's going on in society. We are called to be thermostats, not thermometers. Thermometers just tell the temperature. We're actually called as faith leaders to adjust that temperature. When it gets too hot, we need to turn it down. And when it gets too cold, we need to turn it up. And right now, let's be honest, it's too hot. And so we've got work to do. I'll say more about that at the close, but I hope that I've shaped this in a fashion that you'll understand. It's our obligation as faith leaders to create for our faith communities a place that considers not just what Scripture says, but what society is saying and how Scripture informs that, so that we can correct those things that aren't in line with what our faith says that it should be. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michael, for that theological framing that you've given to us. I'm now going to introduce our two panelist speakers today. They will present to us, and then we'll have time for questions and answers and comments to follow that. So first up today, we will have Avery Davis-Lamb, who is the Federal Policy Associate for Interfaith Power and Light and the Director of Faithful Advocacy for the DC, Maryland, Northern Virginia affiliate of Interfaith Power and Light. He is a contributor to Sojourners Magazine Online, where he has addressed climate denial and silence, all the way up to UN climate negotiations. And so he brings with him a wealth of knowledge about what is going on in our capital. Avery will be followed by Emily Wurzba, who, for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Emily is the legislative representative on sustainable energy and environment. She leads advocacy efforts to achieve bipartisan action on climate change. In Congress, her writings have appeared in The Hill, CNN, U.S. News and World Report, Washington Times, On Faith, The Friends Journal, and Faith and Leadership. So I'm sure many a writer envies Emily's ability to get into all of those sources. So we are delighted to have both of them with us here today. I'll first turn things over to Avery to give a presentation.
Great. Thanks, Brooks. And thanks, Reverend Malcolm, for your theological framing. I think it's really important to think of ourselves as thermostats, not thermometers. And that fits in well with where we're starting the conversation today, which is a conversation around something you may have heard of called the Green New Deal. It's been talked about a lot the last few months. So I'm going to switch over and do a screen share with you and just share a little bit about the Green New Deal to start the conversation from a broad lens. So I guess the first question to start asking is, what is the Green New Deal? We hear a lot about it in the news. Either side of the aisle, there's conversation around the Green New Deal. And that's because it is a really ambitious platform that addresses climate change in a holistic sense. Reverend Malcolm, I love what you said about we need to address the whole matter. It's not, sure there are pieces here and pieces there that we need to address. But like the IPCC report tells us, we have 12 years to turn this thing around. So we need to address the whole matter. And the Green New Deal is something that addresses the whole matter. One thing to note is that the Green New Deal is platform. It is not policy. So that means that its intention is not to pass binding legislation that's going to require our country to do anything, but its intention is to provide a framework so that we can understand what kind of legislation might pass that could actually help us deal with the whole matter. So it helps us start getting into the conversation on the level of ambition that we really need in our country to consider how we're going to respond to the climate crisis in the next 12 years, how we're going to set ourselves up for a net zero economy by 2050, how we're actually going to be in line with what the scientists are saying through the IPCC report and some of the other reports. So it's platform, not policy. It has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. You may recognize that woman in the picture down there. That's Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She has introduced it in the House, and then Senator Markey has introduced it in the Senate. And if I were to break the Green New Deal down into three primary areas, it would be the three E's: environment, economics, and equality. And I'll dig in a little bit more about what those three E's mean. So what does it call for? Well, the first thing is net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is in line with what the IPCC report is saying. It's in line with what all the scientists are saying. And so, even though it doesn't propose specific legislative venues to get there, it says, okay, we need to get here. We need to figure out policy solutions that can get our country to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. As you might have picked up, the Green New Deal is an allusion to President Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a large economic mobilization before World War II that helped stimulate our economy. So similarly in these conversations, there's the Green New Deal is calling for a 10-year mobilization to address climate change, a mobilization on the scale of what we're seeing or what we saw during World War II. And that's because as many people are dying because of climate change all around the world as died in World War II. And so if we're taking that seriously, then perhaps our country needs to think about how are we going to mobilize in a similar way to how we mobilized during that time. The third piece, or a third piece of this, is just transition for workers. So the concept of just transition is that the workers who have been in fossil fuel industries for years are going to be economically affected as we transition to a fossil-free economy. So what just transition says is it's not their fault that they're trying to support their families and that they need these jobs to pay the bills. We want to make sure that we're lifting them up so that everyone's boat is rising as we move towards a renewable economy. And there are a lot of ways to do that, but this Green New Deal platform really does prioritize just transition for fossil fuel workers, for the economically marginalized, so that as we move to a fossil-free economy, that's not being done on the backs of the poor. A fourth piece, of course, is getting 100% of our energy from renewable sources. There are several other really significant pieces. It's quite a large platform. I'd encourage you to read through it if you have a chance. There's a lot of different pieces on agriculture. Here, I included one on here that's to restore and protect threatened, endangered, and fragile ecosystems. So again, this is dealing with the whole matter. And that is what makes it radical in a sense, because It's one of the first places in Congress that we've seen, at least in the last several years, where there's a conversation happening about the scale of the solution that we need. Of course, that also is scaring a lot of people because the scale of the solution is really large. So it's important to think about, as faith communities, how we orient ourselves towards the Green New Deal. You know, on one end, we need solutions that are this big. We need solutions that are addressing the whole matter. But you know, on another end, we need to make sure that we're bringing along all of our communities across the theological and the political spectrum, and providing a space for dialogue around all the different solutions that we can have to climate change. You know, I've heard a metaphor once that the solution to climate change is not going to be a silver bullet, it's going to be a silver buckshot. And so this is a really great framework, but as a faith community, as the WISC table and as Interfaith Power and Light, we're orienting ourselves to this indeed as a platform and as a good starting point for conversation around climate change. And we're using it as an opportunity to talk about, okay, what are the principles that we want to see reflected in legislation that comes out of the Green New Deal framework? So what we put together in collaboration with the WISC table, I'll get back to this question in a second, in collaboration with the WISC table, is faith principles for a Green New Deal. So we did a lot of thinking and introspection with our communities about what are the principles that we want to see reflected in legislation that comes out of the goals of the Green New Deal. And so we broke this down into 4 different categories. The first is truth and science. So we want solutions that are in line with scientific consensus on global warming and that respond with the needed urgency and thoroughness. We want solutions that prioritize restoration and renewal. So that's economic and environmental revitalization that includes job programs, skills training, education, investment in a clean energy economy, and just transition for both urban and rural areas. We want solutions that prioritize compassion and fairness. So that means just treatment for all, including workers and communities most dependent on fossil fuel energy. And then finally, we want solutions that prioritize interdependence across boundaries. We want to see sacred dialogue across political, geographic, and racial boundaries, because that's what our faith communities are good at. We're good at truth, we're good at restoration, we're good at compassion, and we're good at interdependence. And so this is what our faith communities are bringing to the table around the Green New Deal conversation. Yes, we need something that deals with the whole matter, and we need something that prioritizes these 4 principles. The document is a little bit longer than that. Under each of these 4 points, there are some subpoints, and I invite you to read through that at bit.ly/GNDfaith. You can also see there are over 100 organizations across the United States that have signed on to these faith principles for a Green New Deal. And you can see them listed out here in very small font. So if your organization has signed on or hasn't signed on, you can check here. And if not, then if you would be interested in signing on, if you're part of a faith-based organization, then you can see my contact info. I have a slide on here with that, and we can be in touch. So just to loop back to a question that I skipped over here earlier is, so what's up with this Synod vote? I don't know if you saw recently that there was actually a vote on the Green New Deal in the Synod. So the story behind that is the Green New Deal, because of its radical nature, is seen as a significant wedge issue in Congress right now. And so essentially the vote that happened in the Senate was a political ploy to get any of the senators on the books, either supporting or not supporting the Green New Deal. So what we saw is all of the Republicans voting against the Green New Deal, and then all of the Democrats voting present. So in effect, it doesn't really have any effect on the conversation going on. It actually provided a really important space for conversation about climate solutions and an opportunity to ask, okay, if you're not here for the Green New Deal, then what are your climate solutions? What are you bringing to the table? And it's that sacred dialogue across boundaries that I think we really need in Congress now more than ever. So we're still, despite the vote, despite the Green New Deal being defeated in the Senate. We're still going to see this conversation going forward. But likely any of the legislation that we see is going to be, it's probably not going to say Green New Deal. So it's going to address the Green New Deal platform, but it probably will not say Green New Deal. So what can you do in your community to act on the Green New Deal? Well, here are 3 things that you can take away right now. These can be your Earth Day actions on the Green New Deal. The first thing is sign these faith principles that we talked about. So there's a link here, and I can also make sure and send that link out in the chat box in just a second. But there are individual sign-ons along with the organizational sign-on that I mentioned earlier. So add your name so that you can be part of these faith principles for a Green New Deal. The second is, in your community, make sure that you're talking about solutions that are at the scale of the problem. The Green New Deal presents a good opportunity to talk about that. Make sure you integrate that in your community. You know, yes, personal decisions are good. You know, yes, there are small policies that are really important. But if we're going to deal with the whole matter, we need solutions that are up to scale to the problem. So have those conversations in your community. And then the third is, call your senators and your representative and ask them to support legislation that addresses the goals of the Green New Deal. And this is an ask for anyone, you know, across the political spectrum. And you can frame it however you want. You can frame it using the faith principles, but ask them to support or even introduce legislation that gets to the heart of the whole matter. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass the conversation around or along to Emily.
Great, thanks so much, Avery, and thanks Brooks and Malcolm for hosting us. I'm really excited about this conversation today, and as Avery mentioned, we're really seeing a lot of openings this Congress to talk about climate change. I've seen a huge shift in the past 4 months in how both Republicans and Democrats are messaging about the issue. You've got major committees that are holding hearings on climate change, and you have Republicans and Democrats engaging in a meaningful way and actually starting to talk about solutions rather than just the science. And so I am pretty hopeful that we're gonna see some good action take place this Congress. And I think there's, you know, as Avery mentioned, you know, we don't know when we're gonna see legislation enacting the goals of the Green New Deal, but I think there's a lot that can be done in this very Congress right now to help lay that foundation. And so, you know, we have legislative proposals now coming from members of both parties to address climate change. Granted, the majority are still coming from Democrats, but we also have Republican solutions coming now too. And so what I want to do is delve into one of those solutions, carbon pricing, a little bit more. So I'm going to also share my screen. Awesome. So briefly want to go over the basics of carbon pricing, what it is. So carbon pricing is a market-based solution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It places a fee on the burning of fossil fuels, which then would increase the demand for clean energy sources. And ultimately, the goal of a price on carbon is to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think there are lots of ways to reduce emissions. This is one tool, and I think some of the members in the faith community are considering this as one of many tools that Congress can use to kind of eventually reach the goals laid out under the Green New Deal or the goals laid out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so if you remember the latest report that came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a few months ago actually states that explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. So they're not saying it's the only solution, it's not a silver bullet, but it is one of many tools. And I think it's a tool that many economists will agree is one very cost-effective lever to actually reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions at the scale and speed necessary. There are many ways that you can design such a policy and lots of questions that need to be addressed when thinking about carbon pricing. So I'm going to go through what a couple of those questions are. This is by no means an exhaustive list. So there's a question around where do you enact the fee? Do you enact it at the coal mine, at the kind of the point of extraction? Do you, enact it on the utility as they're producing electricity? Or do you put it directly on the consumer? I think there are lots of ways you can think about that. You have to think about how much you're charging per ton of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions, right? And you have to figure out how quickly is the price increasing, because the thought is if you put a price per ton of emissions, then every year it'll increase and help shift the market away to cleaner sources. But there's a really valid question around, what do you do if the price isn't working and our emissions are still going up? What are the environmental safeguards and those mechanisms that will make sure that you're actually getting the emissions reduction amount that you want? There's also a question around border leakage. How do you ensure that a fossil fuel production company doesn't just move overseas to avoid paying the fee, right? Do we have to think about a border tax adjustment or some sort of way to make sure that we're still globally seeing emissions reductions? Then there's a massive question around, what do you do with the revenue? We're talking about possibly trillions of dollars collected from a price on carbon, and there are endless ways to use that revenue. You can give it back as a dividend to individual households to offset their increase in electricity and gas prices. You can invest it in innovation, clean energy, R&D. You can put it in building climate resilient infrastructure or helping local communities adapt to climate change. You can give it directly to low-income communities that are going to be hardest hit by this. You can put it into job creation. You can offset the payroll tax. There's so many things you can do with it. And I think this is where a lot of the contention actually comes into play. Like, how do you effectively send this revenue? There's also some controversy over carbon pricing. I think there are potential concerns that kind of each of us needs to seriously consider before we support any one policy. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the questions that we've been thinking about within our WISC interfaith group. So one, do you trade away regulatory authority in some way to get more political buy-in of a piece of legislation? Currently, several of the bills that are introduced in Congress do that. They do a temporary rollback or a pause in enforcement to give the policy a chance to work. But some people support that and some don't. So it's a really important question to consider. I think there are also questions around market-based solutions in general. Can they address historic racism and the harms that fossil fuel extraction has caused communities? How do you design a market-based solution so it won't just allow continued pollution in the low-income neighborhoods or communities of color? And so those are real questions. I think you can think about the design of a carbon price. You can also think about pairing the bill with another sort of policy to address those concerns, but those are real questions that need to be answered. How do you make sure that a carbon tax isn't regressive? How do you make sure that it actually protects those that are most vulnerable? So a few examples we've been hearing lately are, what about a person who lives in a more rural area who has to drive 30 minutes to get to a grocery store, right? They're going to be impacted disproportionately in terms of the price they're paying compared to someone who lives in an urban area and can take public transportation. What about those that are working in the fossil fuel industry or those communities that are relying upon fossil fuels? These are all really important questions that need to be considered with carbon pricing. And again, how does this affect transient communities or families that don't even earn enough to pay taxes? What about undocumented communities? There's so many questions that I think as the religious community, we have a really unique way of amplifying that moral voice as we're considering policy design. And I think one thing that gives me hope is that I've been on the Hill a lot these past few months talking to both Republicans and Democrats about carbon pricing. And both Republicans and Democrats in Congress are concerned about these very questions. Every single office I talk to asks about how this policy will affect low-income communities and those people in their districts that are reliant upon federal assistance to help pay for their heating bill during the winter. So these are really, these are questions that are being considered by both parties. I will also just say there is not one kind of uniform religious response to how they support a particular type of carbon price. So I will say within our interfaith working group, there are particular organizations that have endorsed specific pieces of legislation. There are organizations that are open to the concept of carbon pricing more broadly, but still have questions and are still trying to figure out kind of what their own evaluation is of the policy. There are also organizations that sit at our interfaith table that are opposed to carbon pricing as a solution. So I want to just make it clear that there are a lot of conversations that are happening right now, and I think we're trying to figure out, can we say anything collectively as a faith community about carbon pricing? Maybe we just can ask some really good questions, but kind of what is our role? And I think just to make it really clear that there are still differences in this space. So I want to go through a couple of the bills that are currently on the table. Some are getting more attention than others. So there are 4 that I'm going to talk about in particular briefly. And maybe we can send these slides around so you don't have to write everything down. So maybe the one that you've heard about the most is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividends Act of 2019. This is a bipartisan bill. It's currently in the House, led by Congressman Ted Deutsch, a Democrat from Florida, and Francis Rooney, a Republican from Florida. They have 28 members currently supporting the bill. It was actually bipartisan in the House and Senate last Congress, but it has not been reintroduced in the Senate this year. So under this model, you can see I listed out, it would be $15 per ton of emissions. The price would rise $10 per year, and is expected to reduce emissions by 33% by 2030. And they decided to use the revenue as a dividend given back to every single household. I want to also just do the disclaimer that this is a very simplistic summary of each of these bills. You can find much more information online. There's a lot more nuance than what I'm giving you, but these are just some really broad brushstrokes. So another bill that has support is the Market Choice Act of 2018. This was introduced in the last Congress. It was a Republican-only bill led by Carlos Curbelo, a Republican from Florida, along with 2 other Republicans. His has a shorter, his puts $24 per ton on emissions and would rise 2% each year, and is expected to also reduce emissions by 30 to 40% by 2030. His bill only looks at the next decade. It doesn't talk about kind of beyond 2030, so it's a shorter term bill. And for that bill, the revenue is actually invested in infrastructure. 70% of it goes towards the Highway Trust Fund. He also sets aside money for low-income assistance, coastal adaptation, R&D, and much more. And that's awaiting reintroduction. We expect that that bill will be reintroduced by Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, in the next few months. So there are 2 other bills I want to flag for you. These are not the only bills out there. There are lots of bills. But another one was introduced a few weeks ago. It's called the Healthy Climate and Family Security Act. This one is Democrat only, and it's currently in both the House and the Senate. Congressman Don Beyer and Senator Christine Holland. And this is a slightly different model. It's a cap in dividend. So it's still putting a price on carbon pollution, but it's capping the amount of carbon pollution allowed to be emitted each year. And you basically auction off permits to pollute, and each year the number of permits is reduced, which will also help reduce our emissions gradually, and the revenue would get returned to every single individual as a dividend. So it's a little different model, but it's another way of pricing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And this would make sure that we cap our emissions at 50% by 2030. And then another bill was actually just introduced yesterday by Senator Whitehouse, Senator Schatz, and a few others, called the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act. And this is probably the most ambitious in terms of kind of price and ramping up. It starts at $52 a ton and would rise 6% annually, and it would get us to 51% emissions reductions by 2029. And he uses the revenue partially as a tax credit for every worker to offset the payroll tax, and then invest billions of dollars for climate adaptation, assistance for workers transitioning away from the fossil fuel industry, and low-income communities. So I wanted to put all of these bills on the table, not because I'm personally working on all of them, but I think it's important to know that there are a range of solutions out there around carbon pricing right now. And we're going to expect to see additional bills coming from both Republicans and Democrats over the next few months. I can already think of like 4 or 5 more that will be introduced in the coming months. And so we have an important opportunity as the religious community to think about which ones we like, which ones we don't, why that is, and to share our thoughts with our legislators. So I'll close with, we don't expect the majority of these bills to get a vote this year, but it's still really important to build up long-term support for this is one of many solutions that Congress should consider. By no means this is not the only way that we can reduce emissions, but it is one important tool. And I'll say that while this is kind of a longer term strategy of education and building up support, Congress right now has a more short-term focus on something called the appropriations process, which is basically kind of, we think about our federal budget, and its appropriations is allocating kind of who gets what money. So it says the EPA gets this many millions of dollars, and underneath that, the EPA should use for all these different programs X amount of dollars. So this is the only must-pass spending bill. It's one of the only things that Congress has to do. And so this is a really good opportunity to kind of advance our priorities on climate change and the environment. So we expect that for most of the spring and summer, appropriations and kind of spending our money is going to be where Congress is putting most of their energy. So I want to just flag that as a really key opportunity for us to influence what members of Congress are working on. We could do a whole nother webinar just on appropriations, so I won't say more for now. But I think the thing I want to close with is that, to me, I think carbon pricing can fit within the framework articulated by the Green New Deal. This does not have to be a conversation about you either support the goals of the Green New Deal or you support carbon pricing. I think that's a false choice, and that there are really important ways that these things can work together. And we're going to need, as Avery said, lots and lots of solutions under a framework of the Green New Deal. So this is one to consider. So I'll stop there. And I think Avery has some more he's going to share.
Great, thanks, Emily. And I see a question from Grant Millen here about HR 9. Grant, you are in luck, because that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. First, though, I wanted to hit on another committee that you may have been hearing about that was just formed recently, which is the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. So the Select Committee was originally formed, I think in 2008, as a place to drive conversation around climate solutions. They don't have full committee power because they are a select committee, but they are able to hold hearings that drive conversation and help talk about what different solutions for the climate crisis might look like. So they had their first hearing 2 weeks ago. And as you can see here, this is the first panel. And what they did is they lifted up the voices of 4 young people who are working on climate change and already being affected by our climate. One of whom is Melody Zhang, who is a person of faith who's working at Sojourners. She's the climate justice associate there, and she was able to bring a faith-rooted approach to that panel. So we're even seeing faith woven into the conversation on the Select Committee on the climate crisis. So this is another place to be watching the climate conversation, because this is where, in Congress, there is a constructed space for our members to be talking about that. So on to HR 9. Which is also known as the Climate Action Now Act. I don't know if the exclamation mark is actually in the act, but I added it in for emphasis because that's what we want. We want climate action now. So this was just introduced also I think 2 weeks ago, and I can go through what exactly it is. So it was introduced by the chair of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, Representative Castor. And basically what it does is it requires the United States to remain in the Paris Agreement. And the way that it does that is it prohibits any funds from being used to withdraw the country from the agreement. So if there aren't any funds to withdraw us, then we have to stay in. It also requires the president to develop a plan to meet the Paris Agreement emissions goals. So this is, it's only been introduced in the House. Again, the likelihood of it passing both chambers is quite low. You know, we can always hope and pray and advocate. But this is just another really important message that's being sent by Congress, being sent by the House, that the Paris Agreement matters, that the goals of the Paris Agreement matter, and that Congress is going to take its role seriously in defending the Paris Agreement. So what is the faith community's response to this? Well, I think it's important to fit this in a frame of how we've been involved in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process, on the Conference of Parties. So people of faith have really been involved in this process since the beginning, particularly when the Paris Agreement was agreed upon in 2015, and in the process of the country signing on to it, people of faith from around the world, from all different religions, were involved in casting a moral vision for this, and helping hold our leaders accountable so that the Paris Agreement really is on target for where our world needs to be. So that, includes being at the Paris climate talks in Paris, as well as advocating back here to ensure the United States is in the Paris Agreement. And so going forward, it's the same momentum that we've been involved in negotiating the Paris Agreement. Of course, we're going to be involved to ensure that the United States remains in the Paris Agreement. So one space of faith response is a faith letter to Congress that is being put together as part of this WISC-EEWG table that is hosting or co-hosting this webinar. And just to read a little slice from this letter that we'll be sending to Congress. It says, for the religious community, our priorities regarding climate change reflect several moral requirements to protect and assist the poorest peoples and nations, to defend our children's health, to care for God's creation, and to fulfill our obligation to future generations. Keeping the United States in the Paris Agreement is urgently needed if we are to meet our moral obligations to protect God's earth and God's people. And then I think a third space where faith communities have really been involved in the Paris Climate Agreement, and in the energizing conversation around HR 9 is the We're Still in Paris pledge. So there are tens of thousands of people of faith and several thousand congregations around the US who have committed to stay in Paris despite President Trump's attempt to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And then again, another slice from that statement is a commitment to say my household or my faith community will continue to work to protect creation regardless of what the US federal government does. We are still committed to fighting global warming. We are keeping the faith, and we are still in. So we actually delivered a scroll with tens of thousands of these signatures to one of the leaders at the UN Climate Conference this year to demonstrate that despite what the federal government is doing in this moment, people of faith are committed to the Paris Agreement. And I think HR 9, Climate Action Now, is a really important place for federal advocacy for us to express that in an advocacy capacity. So what can we do? Well, you can sign the We're Still in Paris pledge. It's still open, and that's available at interfaithpowerandlight.org/we're-still-in-Paris. I can make sure and send that out in the chat link as well. And then the second thing is to call your representatives and ask them to support the Climate Action Now Act, which is HR 9. The conversation around this is happening right now, right in this moment. So if you're looking for something to call your representatives about today, this is something that is really salient at the moment, and we're expecting a vote in the next couple weeks. So just quickly, I wanted to put up this slide with some of the contact information of the folks who have been involved in putting this together, this webinar from the WISC-EEWG side. So feel free to write this down or to take a screenshot. But if you're interested in getting in touch with us afterwards with any questions, or if you need any help or information about advocacy, we would be glad to help. I'll leave this up for just a moment, but I'll go ahead and hand it over to Brooks as we move into our Q&A session.
Great. Thank you both to Avery and Emily for those very helpful and insightful comments. We've got a couple of questions. One came in actually before our webinar today with the question via email. The question is, I would like to know whether the carbon dividend legislation includes provisions giving fossil fuel companies protection from legal liability.
So I'm happy to answer that question. There is one organization called the Climate Leadership Council that is primarily run by former Republican statesmen. They have a draft bill that is, a price on carbon, returns the revenue as a dividend to every household, and would protect oil companies from liability and from lawsuits. This bill has not actually been introduced in Congress yet, so it is not currently supported by any members of Congress right now. I don't know where they stand in trying to find a co-sponsor, but that is one model. There are lots of other models. All the other ones in Congress that I've seen don't do that. They don't protect the oil companies.
All right, thank you. And I see that Fran has her hand held here. So Fran, I'm going to give you a chance to talk if you have a question for the panelists. Fran Ludwig, do you have a question for the panelists?
Fran, you're on mute.
Okay, so my question is just if we can get a summary of the links that you provided, and I think maybe we missed the contact slide. That would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I can make sure that the whole PowerPoint slide deck is included.
Yes, that would be excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can make that happen.
Good, thank you.
All right. Yep, I'll send out an email to everyone after this with information shared, as well as a YouTube recording of this webinar presentation. All right. Other comments and questions here. Let's see. I see some comments here from Grant. Just trying to see if those have been addressed. Avery, or Emily, do you want to take a stab at the Grant's comments and questions and responding to those?
Sure. Yeah, Grant, I think you're right on with HR 9. It's I think right now it's a really important piece of the puzzle. But as we've said before, the whole matter is going to take a silver buckshot approach. So it's one piece, but certainly not the entire package.
Yeah, and I see, Grant, you referenced another bill, Senate Bill 332. I'm not familiar with that one. I will say over the years, there have been a whole variety of different types of bills introduced in Congress, and it's difficult to know which ones will actually get the momentum and maybe build up enough support to have a vote on the floor. So I can definitely look into that bill and just read a bit about it and see if there are plans to have that bill reintroduced this Congress. I think right now we're in an interesting moment where there are so many different types of solutions being put forward with so many different ways that you can use the revenue. And I think it's an amazing opportunity that we now get to talk about which solution we like better rather than just focusing on, is the problem even happening? So to me, that's progress. And I'll also just say, I think it can be hard, and I know there's a lot of anger and frustration with a lot of Republicans in Congress for their voting records and for their denialism. But I'm also very cognizant that there are lots of Republicans in Congress that really do want to take action. I was in a meeting this morning where a Republican staffer was incredibly articulate about the need to reduce emissions and carbon pricing and equity concerns around people of color and women. And it was amazing coming from a Republican staffer. And I just think it's important that we hold open the possibility of changing minds, and hearing from their constituents is the way that members of Congress from both parties will take greater action on this issue. And I think as the faith community, we have a very unique way of reaching out to our legislators, regardless of party. And ultimately, we're going to need votes from both parties if we want to get anything signed into law. And so I think it's important that we try to hold that tension and frustration and still engage in respectful dialogue where we can, because I think it's been working, right? You know, we're seeing a shift in the rhetoric, and that change will only continue in a positive direction if we keep up our dialogue and our respectful outreach.
Got a couple more questions that have come in. One is there any legislation about resiliency for the coastlines and flooding issues? Either Emily have
that's a good question. I don't know of any right now at the federal level. I know there's a lot of conversation about if an infrastructure package goes forward this year, which rumor is at some point this year, there will be an infrastructure package. I think there's a lot of interest about including resiliency pieces, both as far as climate adaptation goes, but also as far as climate mitigation goes. And so I would guess that would be a place for some of these coastal resiliency pieces.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think there are conversations right now about reforming the National Flood Insurance Program. There have been conversations around something called the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which is a former Obama executive order that President Trump overturned that would make sure that any infrastructure project using federal dollars takes into account climate risk. So taking into account sea level rise projections, coastal adaptation and kind of coastal resiliency was funded in the carbon price that Congressman Curbelo introduced last summer. So it's definitely being thought of as one way that we can use revenue for. And I think we'll see a lot more bills, especially as Avery mentioned, if we're talking about infrastructure.
Right. And then another question we've had come in is, any thoughts about climate advocacy for the 2020 elections, with the understanding nothing will be signed into law by our current president?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I think most of us here are part of 501c3 nonprofits. So, while we can do get out the vote, we, can't do campaigning, we can't do electioneering. But what we can do is we can drive the conversation leading up to the 2020 election and ensure that we're talking about climate change, ensure that all the candidates say where they are on climate change and that we hold them accountable. And so I think that, that is a place for our faith communities as well, as, we can express our values in the lead up to an election. And if our values are caring for creation and for the climate, then we need to do that.
I'd just like to add to that about driving the conversation is that each faith community can come up with some of their own questions to ask at the state as well as at the national level, and make really intentional efforts to appear at forums where the candidates are appearing, and submit those questions also to them individually.
Brooks, I see one question.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I see one question over here from Judy in the chat box that I wanted to hit on. And our question is, thanks for your commentary about Republicans and climate change. What risks do you see with the Green New Deal alienating Republicans to the point of sabotaging the planet? And I think that's an important conversation, and one where the faith community is really important to kind of have this, this tedious approach of, we support the goals of the Green New Deal, but we want conversation in these 4 principles around what that looks like. And we can have that conversation without even saying the Green New Deal. The words Green New Deal have been so politicized, but the goals are still there, and we need to address the goals. And so as much as we're able to use that kind of messaging, the faith-based messaging, I think we're finding that resonates with Republicans. Is, all we have to do is just take out Green New Deal, the language.
Yeah, and I'll add, it's been interesting to see a lot of Republicans in Congress will now say, I don't support the Green New Deal, but here are the things that I support instead. And we can have a legitimate debate about if those solutions they're putting forward are enough, but it is shifting the conversation for them. So in some ways, it's been really helpful. I will also say, though, I think I hear your caution, and I've heard that reflected from some Republican offices as well, who want to address climate change. They might not be ready to go all the way to the goals of the Green New Deal, but they want to work on some of those steps that they can take right now. And I think remembering that there are lots of things that we could do right now that have bipartisan support that help lay the foundation for some of the more ambitious goals of the Green New Deal. So examples might be investment in energy efficiency, both in buildings and in appliances, tax credits, and more research in energy storage, looking at our electricity grid and kind of clean infrastructure. There are a lot of things that we could hypothetically pass this Congress with support of both parties. So ensuring that those are the opportunities, and those still fit within this framework of the Green New Deal, right? So I think it's it's trying to figure that out and making sure that we aren't alienating votes on those critical issues that will be absolutely critical if we're going to see the goals of the Green New Deal enacted.
All right, great. And I just want to point out, I've added a couple of links just going back to the issue of elections. So historically, people who care about the environment tend to vote at a far less rate than the rest of the population. And so there's the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that addresses that and works to turn out environmental voters. And they've partnered with us to create the Creation Care Voter Pledge to encourage people that are members of faith communities to vote their values. And so one can take the Creation Care Voter Pledge. And so I shared that link there. And there was a church in Boston this past year that blessed the pledges in worship and collected them in worship. So so that's something to keep in mind there. Let's see, other questions or comments here. I'm just checking real quick. We're nearing the end of our time, I see. We always like to end our calls with the Reverend Michael Malcolm giving us a call to action. Michael, would you have any thoughts for us as we come to a close?
Absolutely. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, any religion that professes to be concerned with the souls of men and is not concerned with the slums that damn, the economic conditions that strangle, and the social conditions that cripple them is a dry as dust religion. I'll add to that, not only are we concerned with the slums that damn, the economic conditions that strangle, and the social conditions that cripple them, but we're also concerned with the environmental conditions that pollute and also destroy. So we want to make sure that we're speaking up for those. The solutions that were given to you for us to actually put some action behind. As Brother Avery has said, we've only got 12 years according to science. 12 years doesn't lend for us to continue to operate in our silos. We've got to come together. And as faith leaders, we're challenged to become ambassadors of this ambitious vision that is rooted in both equity and injustice. We've not only got to come together, but we've got to move together. And we've got to use what we have, which is our voices. Our voices shape hopeful narratives. They speak truth. They set the temperature in the hearts of the people. Our voices are the voices of the prophet Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones. It was the voice that spoke to those bones, and those bones became living beings. It's our voice. If we speak, nature will realign once again. If we could just speak, connections will be made, and wholeness will become a fruition. And life will begin again, but we've got to speak. There are organizations out there that are speaking as we speak. The IPL organization is already speaking. You've got friends that are speaking. You've got several different organizations that work. Green Faith is speaking. Several different organizations that work in your local area as well as nationally and globally that we can actually be a part of. Again, we cannot afford to operate in our silos. I understand that our sanctuaries are sacred to us, and they are, in fact, a sanctuary for us. But unfortunately, my brothers and my sisters, we are now called to come out of our sanctuaries and actually get into the streets and compel men and women to come. Thank you for your time. We thank you for being a part. We appreciate it, and we hope that you've been challenged and celebrated in this moment.
All right, thank you, Michael. And thank you to our panelists for the excellent job that you have done in educating us about these vitally important issues and getting us prepared for Earth Day so that we can be inspired as we address climate policy issues in our nation today. There couldn't be anything better, I feel like, than to be with all of you addressing what is I feel, the call of our generation today. So thank you. And if you are interested in our next Creation Justice webinar, I put a link to it. Just in the past couple of weeks, our next guest entered into the New York Times bestseller list, Adrienne Marie Brown. She will be talking to us out of a wealth of experience from the environmental justice movement and the Black liberation movement, as she talks to us about emergent strategies for addressing environmental justice. And so we are looking forward to having her at the end of this month. Until next time, thanks a lot, and we'll be in touch via email as we send out the recording of today's webinar, along with all the other things that have been offered up. Thanks a lot.